Welcome to the Two Peds in a Pod podcast. It's a new year and we are some new voices coming to the Two Peds podcast. It's fantastic to be here and we're very grateful to Ian for giving over the seat of hosting this for myself and my colleague Adriel to present this podcast to you. So my name's Ashley Reece. I'm a paediatrician and a medical educator. I work at Watford General Hospital, part of West Hertfordshire Hospital's NHS Trust. And today I'm delighted to be co-presenting this podcast about podcasts with Adriel Chen.
Hi, my name is Adriel. I am an FY2 in the Glasgow Royal Infirmary in Scotland. I am interested in paediatrics as well as medical education. And once again, just as Ashley said, delighted to be involved in the podcast. Also delighted that Ian is opening it up for further discussion. And yes, this is a podcast about podcasts, which is quite meta, but also quite, as I hope you will understand, quite important to talk about and consider.
Absolutely. It's one of those, I think Doctor Who fans might understand the ontological paradox where there's something within something. But the conversations we've been having at the Two Peds in a Pod headquarters are around continuing professional development and trying to work out what the value is in podcasts and such media for continuing education. And Adriel and I came up with an idea to try and put that down into a podcast and work out what the educational value is about podcasts, trying to look at some of the published evidence out there and thinking about some educational theories, as well as what it means to us to listen to podcasts and to use them in our continuing education.
Yeah, so I think as a millennial, as someone who is young, as someone who has a mobile device, a podcast is something that you listen to, that becomes a part of your daily routine. And that does involve the question, do I use this for education? Can I use this for education? And does it have educational value? And if it does have educational value, can this be considered as part of CPD, as part of my professional development as a doctor to improve myself, to improve my clinical practice?
We're all learning, obviously, and some of us are more obvious learners, those in medical training as undergraduates or even in postgraduate medical training. And there's been this concept for a number of years about continuing professional development. And one of the mantras, I guess, that's come out over time for this CPD, as it's known, is the notion of CPD points and how you accrue points and how many points you get, and in fact, what you get points for. And it's quite interesting if you look into it, because many of my colleagues involved in education, anyone else involved in learners and in the learning environment, would understand that points actually don't make prizes, despite what some of the game show hosts might tell you. And I think for me, it's far much more about what this episode of learning means to you. And rather than say I got 3, 4, 8 or 10 points for this activity, a reflective note, something in your portfolio saying, look, I listened to this podcast, it was really interesting, and these are my 3 takeaway points. I think that is far more value than saying I got 3 points for that activity. So that's the frame that I come to this with, and that's how I think about certainly my continuing professional development. The points may well be a shorthand for saying that you actually did an activity, but I think it's far more richer to try and say what you got out of the activity. Don't you think that means a whole lot more?
So just to summarize here, Ashley, is what you're saying that points are good, but points reflect the purpose of the activity, and it might actually be an arbitrary value placed on a learning or a educational activity that you're doing. In this case, in this discussion, a podcast, but sometimes it could be a lecture from a college. It could be a course that you've gone to. So what actually is continuous professional development, in your opinion, as a medical educator, actually?
Well, CPD is continuing professional development. And this is defined as any learning outside of undergraduate or postgraduate training programs that help you maintain and improve your performance, covering knowledge, skills and attitudes across all areas of professional practice. Its main aim, of course, is to ensure that the quality of care you give is high and that you keep yourself up to date, maintaining educational, training, learning activities in your chosen area. So there are many activities that may come under this umbrella. For example, maybe that you read a journal in your chosen specialty, you may attend a conference in your specialist area, or you may dip into various other education training resources, local ones put on at your trust, or any others that you may find on the internet, including, of course, listening to podcasts. So it's very personally tailored to what you need. It's mainly for anyone not in a training program and more traditionally thought of for people having finished their training, so maybe a post-CCT or in a non-training program, and it helps you develop yourself in a field. As adult learners, of course, we're motivated to keep ourselves up to date. Of course, it's about having a contract to learn, maintain standards, and keep yourself up to date and competent in all the work that you do. So it's that commitment to continue to learn and progress and develop. And I think that in your foundation training, you will have generic competencies and you'll need to try and those by the end of your 2 foundation years. For those of us post completion of training, we're also on a learning journey every day and have activities that we need to do to keep up our training, either within our desired specialty area or even other aspects of our education and training. And training is not linear, so it may be that you fall into something or have an interest in something that takes you down a different route.
We've talked about CPDs, but what actually is this point system that we see in various conferences and advertisements for events?
Well, I always like to go back to the rules of the game and back to source. And of course, as the accrediting professional body, the General Medical Council, I went to see what they said about CPD points. And actually, they don't endorse or accredit particular CPD activities. And they don't give continuing professional development points or credits for learning activities. And neither do they hold a list of CPD providers. So it would seem that points have evolved as a shorthand for saying that you did this course or attended this activity. And so I guess it comes back to what we've been saying around what the education activity means for you personally and how it is factored into your learning, training, education. Some of the Royal Colleges use an accumulation of points, a total of points, a number of points in every year as a shorthand way of saying that you've done certain CPD type activities. And so you could say, I've got 20 points this year, which implies that you've been keeping your CPD up to date. But of course, that doesn't necessarily translate to you having learnt anything useful. It doesn't necessarily translate to you having furthered yourself in training, or doesn't necessarily equal magically to new knowledge gained. That comes down to you and what you got out of the course or activity you were doing. I should just say finally on this point, one of the best certificates that I was given for attending a course was one that had obviously all the bits on the front saying, you attended this course on such and such a date, confirmation of attendance. But it had a big section at the bottom that said, please write down your top take-home messages from this this course or this day. And I think that's a really excellent way of framing your CPD activities in that reflective way that means a whole lot more to you as an individual.
And leading on from that, given that there is a requirement to continue professional development and to improve and to keep up to date, how does a podcast or podcasts factor into this whole world of professional development?
So podcasts are one of the tools that you can use to try and evidence that you're keeping up to date. So if you're listening to a podcast in your chosen specialty area or area of interest, or in a particular topic area that you feel that you need updating on, or something that you don't know much about, then this is one of the ways in which you can demonstrate that. So it may be a podcast, it may be a journal article, it may be going on a course, it may be attending a conference, it may be looking up a paper, it may be writing an article. There are many ways that you can demonstrate that you're keeping up to date, and listening to a podcast or even being involved in a podcast may be one of the ways in which you can demonstrate that.
I guess we're getting at a situation where we're discussing CPD points as a way to quantify your learning. But then that doesn't quite address all the time, most of the time, sometimes. It doesn't address the quality of the training that you're getting. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that we often talk about quality and quantity in medical education, and certainly in education research.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's an excellent way of framing it. But it comes down to what it means to actually do an activity and what you get out of it. So in terms of podcasts, I'd be interested to know what your view is on podcasts as an education, as a learning tool, and how you use them to further your education.
That's a good question. I think to get into that, we might have to backtrack a little bit into why podcasts in the first place. So I started listening to podcasts as a way to break up a sort of daily routine when I was commuting to work. I'd listen to a podcast, and it was initially things like the news or sort of current affairs and breakdowns of things. And then I thought to myself, hang on, if there's a podcast for everything, surely there's a podcast for medical education or something that I could learn, especially as an FY1 when I was going to work and having to deal with things that you would have thought medical school would prepare you for, and it does prepare you for, but not as adequately as you would have liked. And so I turned to podcasts and found this incredible world of educationalists and physicians who were more than willing to share not just the hard side of medicine, the actual what do we do with a patient with sepsis, but also the softer side of medicine. So things like, how do we reflect on what has happened to make us better clinicians? And I found that really helpful. And then I stumbled upon pediatric podcasts, and that was another thing. So I think, in a nutshell, to answer your question, Ashley, a podcast is useful because it's something that you listen to, and that is something that you can think about and reflect on. And it's a bit more engaging than, suppose, to say, reading a book. It's something I can listen to while I'm commuting and walking. And it's in a medium that is easily accessible. And I think accessibility is a huge factor in choosing podcasts as a preferred medium for medical education and to stay up to date and informed and educated about things.
So I think you encapsulate all of the great value that this medium brings to learning and education. It creates a different modality, and one that maybe as medics we're sort of more attuned into, because we probably by definition multitaskers, and so if you can listen to something that's absorbing, engaging, that's short enough, that's interesting enough while you're doing another activity that doesn't require absolutely all of your attention, the accessibility in terms of on devices certainly over the last sort of 10 to 15 years has just increased immeasurably, and so it's become a very widely available modality for people to dip into.
Yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence that this growing emphasis and podcast culture, as we can call it, coincides with a rise in the idea of a work-life balance, and the fact that we are expected to have a life, and we should definitely have a life outside of work, where we have hobbies, we have passions, we run, we do sports, we cook. And unfortunately, this has also coincided with the rise of this demand for us to be multi-hyphenate individuals, that we are doctors slash academics, doctors slash educationalists, and it then boils down to, how do I maximize the time that I have, but in a way that doesn't exhaust me? And I think for myself, for example, I sometimes listen to a podcast while I go for a run, and running is something I do enjoy, but I also enjoy listening to podcasts. And it's two things that, are almost synergistic, in a sense that as I run, I can listen to something and think about it and ruminate as I exercise. So it's not just convenient and accessible, but it's, in some ways, you could argue that podcasts are effective, both time-wise as well as an educational tool.
So I think that's really important. There are two things I'll pick up on there.
Mm-hmm.
We're recording this at the beginning of 2021 amid the second wave of a global pandemic, and throughout the last certainly 9 to 12 months, the way that we access education and learning and the way that that has been delivered has changed immeasurably in light of the restrictions amid the coronavirus pandemic. So here is a modality that has been around for a while, but almost certainly in that time is being used in a new and valuable way to plug the gap possibly for some of the face-to-face teaching that cannot happen. The other thing that you said rightly to pick up on was this sort of community that's created by you joining somebody and them talking to you, or at least you feeling that it's just you and the those involved in the podcast in that moment, and you can pick it up and use it whenever you want. And if you look at some of the educational theories that help support learning, you'll find the podcast actually maps to quite a number of those. One of which, of course, would be the communities of practice described by Levin Wenger, whereby you create this community that has something in common. And in this case, it would be the need to sort of learn and to develop themselves. And you create out there a group with these common aims and common goals that the podcast is there to meet those. And of course, if it's well regarded and well executed and repeated, then there comes investment into that, and then the community grows and develops. And with the longer time that you're involved in it, and the more that you invest in it, the more that you're likely to get out of it.
That's actually really interesting. So just to dive in a bit deeper into what you said there, Ashley. So you're talking about creating a community of learners based on an educational theory by, who was it again?
Levin Wenger had described the original communities of practice. And they did that looking at various professionals and various apprenticeship professions, which is interesting when you think about how medicine sort of certainly used to be, and in many respects still is. The way that you used to learn medicine was by being around and putting in the hours and learning by watching and learning by doing. And here we are in a situation where you're creating a sort of almost virtual community in which to share ideas and have information explained to you in an accessible and easily digestible way.
That's a theory that works. And I think, so in preparing for this episode, we talked about a couple of other educational theories that could be applied as a lens to look at podcasts and examine the educational value of a podcast. So we've talked about one of them. What was the other one?
There are a few research papers in the literature looking at podcasts, interestingly. Some of them are fairly recent, so 2017 from the Korean Journal of Medical Education. Cho and colleagues reviewed the literature around podcasting, and they framed their assessment of podcasts using a model that is often used to assess educational outcomes, which is called Kirkpatrick's outcome hierarchy, which looks at 4 levels: reaction to the education event, including satisfaction and preference, learning involved, particularly knowledge, skills and attitudes, behavior, so the impact on how it might change your practice, and then the 4th level, results, which they suggest impact on patients. Now, while those levels are quite rigid, it can be difficult to fit every educational activity into each of those levels, or outcomes into each of those levels. But they had a good go, and certainly there's quite a lot of evidence out there for the reaction and the learning, but not so much evidencing change in behaviour and outcome on impact on patients. So it seems like the first 2 levels in that hierarchy are met quite well. So we can say that there's certainly a sort of reaction of satisfaction and enjoyment in being involved in listening to a podcast. And there are some papers suggesting there are positive learning outcomes to be derived as well. So if that's a reason to keep listening to Two Peds in a Pod, there you have it.
I mean, that is a really good point, because I think, on a very deeply personal and intrinsic level, I think almost as you're a pediatrician, and children learn and we learn as adults, and there's this intrinsic idea that learning has to be fun, and that learning isn't always fun, but it's a lot better if it's fun. And if people are fulfilling the first and second hierarchy or level of learning, in which they find the activity enjoyable and fun, it does signal that there is something to get out of it. There's something that people will return and gravitate to, and something that is fun. And I guess in some ways it's really hard to prove that a podcast or a lecture has affected your clinical practice. It's a lot easier to do that with a clinical guideline, for example. But I think it might be harder to say, this is the lecture I listened to which changed my clinical practice, or this is the textbook I read which made me have an entirely different approach to how I treat seizures.
Yeah, so I think that's right. And it's very difficult to pinpoint one particular piece of knowledge or piece of advice, or it may be even a culture change. But there's also an enjoyment factor, isn't there, in being able to access learning and education in a more informal way. There are a number of caveats, aren't there? There's often disclaimers. Some of the podcasts put out by some of the more official institutions, particularly in America and Canada, will have very specific disclaimers about using any information contained in the podcast to treat patients, and you should always do so using your clinical initiative and local guidelines and guidance. But underlying all of this, I think, is the movement that is known as FOAM, or FOAM-Ed, which is the free open access medical education. And I think that some of the best resources are out there and accessible to anyone and everyone. I think it's also fair to say, isn't it, that while we're talking about podcasts, and we've mentioned this podcast and the great work that Ian has done over time, creating the movement that is Two Peds in a Pod podcast, there are many other podcasts, as you mentioned at the beginning, medical education podcasts and specific pediatric podcasts, and therein, I think, again, you can select the style, the topic, the version that works for you. And it may be you have a bit like textbooks, really. As an undergraduate, you have a family of different books to dip into. You might have an array of different podcasts to choose from, things that do different things for you at different times, depending on what the topic is and what your needs are.
I guess, leaning into the book analogy, the great thing about podcasts, and as someone who listens to several pediatric medical education podcasts, I openly admit I don't listen to every episode. I pick and choose, and I dip and dive into various podcasts and various episodes of a podcast, like you would with a book chapter. Hopefully not a novel, but with a textbook, certainly. And for example, if I was to say interested in CTs in children, I'd just listen to a podcast on CT hits in children and learn from that. And I think that provides a more accurate way of meeting your educational needs. And I could argue that it would be, convenient and accurate, because I could then choose the episode of the podcast that would meet what I need to learn. But not only that, but going back to what you said there about the numerous other medical podcasts out there and disclaimers, I think it's worth mentioning that it's always important to follow the local guidelines, but also some of the podcasts I've listened to have gone a step further than that and discussed why and how the guidelines came about, and are these really what we should be thinking about. I listened to a podcast episode recently, which is on going back to CTH in children. And, the discussion was also centered around the fact that it was a guideline. And I thought that was really interesting to hear experienced clinicians discussing a guideline versus clinical practice, which is a debate which doesn't get enough attention than it might do in a conference or in a tutorial, for example.
Yes, I think that's a really good point, isn't it? And it's an opportunity to probe and discuss and question and query, and also to get some background on a paper somebody's published or a guideline somebody's written. And I would suggest that sometimes, as well as the hard fact of the guideline, having a bit of background information, putting it into context, and hearing the people that went about a piece of research and how they did it and what went well and what challenges they had. It really does make that piece of work, that guideline, that paper, much more, to me anyway, three-dimensional. It brings it much more to life. And it may help remember some of those take-home points as away, which, sort of brings us a bit full circle really, because it's important to document for your own learning what you get out of an episode of education. So if that's listening to a podcast, putting it in your portfolio as a reflective note is a really good way of documenting that episode of learning and referencing it. That would be a really positive intervention, or positive outcome anyway, of listening to the podcast, and for me means far more than saying I got 2 credits or 3 points for that.
And on the subject of take-home points and just sort of coming full circle, Ashley, as someone who's heavily involved in medical education, who's been there since, I guess, the birth of podcasts with the iPod and whatnot, where do you think medical education podcasts, what direction do you think we're headed to in the future?
So what I'd like to see for the future, well, I think that more of the same, really. There's clearly going to be, if not already, an explosion in material and in types of podcasts being produced. The way the podcast is structured and formulated, whether it's 1, 2 or more people involved in that, I think different styles is useful, as are different modalities and different topic areas, probing and exploring rather than just giving factual information. Time is another issue. Not sure exactly what the ideal length of a podcast should be, but somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes. And I would expect there'd be much more synergy between the social media outlets and the actual podcast recordings. So 2Peds has its own Twitter account, and there's often discussion about the podcast and other areas relating to paediatrics and looking after children, young people and their families there. And in many ways, that is the true communities of practice that we were talking about earlier. That is where the discussion happens, the exchange of ideas, and that is where the podcast can be used as that springboard for change. I would also hope that we can make podcasts much more accessible for our colleagues with hearing problems or who are deaf, maybe with transcripts, for example. I think that would be a good way going forward to make the audio podcast much more accessible. And I would expect it likely to make more of an obvious appearance in those continuing professional development plans by the curricula and educationalists. And I know that many Royal Colleges are putting out their own to support their own learning.
They are, yeah.
I think if it's not exploded already, I think there's going to be far more out there than we already have.
So I think we are possibly looking at an explosion and then a sort of convergence towards the idea of 15 to 30 minutes, more than one speaker, and a structured approach to probing certain topics and discussions. And definitely a greater degree of recognition of podcasts as something that is of value in medical education, if not something niche that people listen to on a run or during some form of household work.
So yes, I think the take-home messages have to be that there's certainly some evidence in the education literature that podcasts have a positive effect. It's clearly a modality that people are using, and by the very nature of their popularity and the number that are out there, people find of value. We don't believe that necessarily they need accreditation in terms of points and it makes perfect educational sense to document your learning and what you got out of a podcast in your own way. So I guess by way of closing, Adriel, what's your podcast plan for 2021? Have you got any New Year's podcast resolutions?
So I have decided that I am going to listen to a greater depth of podcasts, but with medical education, I started to listen to a few more podcasts which deal with a more reflective approach to medicine. And I found that really helpful in a pandemic, to process what's been going on, to process the fact that a lot of the things we now do are over the phone instead of face to face. And I'd like to continue with that. What about yourself, Ashley?
So for me, I'm hoping 2021 obviously brings us a bit more calm. And I'm certainly looking forward to continuing to contribute to the Two Peds in a Pod podcast and produce some material that helps us all look after children, young people and their families in the best way that we can.